Some lessons from the life of Samuel. And when we think of Samuel, what are some things that come to mind from Samuel's life? What are the first things you think about when you think about Samuel?
His mother prayed.
His mother prayed for him. His mother was not having children. She prays to God. And what does she promise God? That God will give her a child. That child is going to be dedicated to God. And from what age was Samuel dedicated to God?
When he was weaned.
When he was weaned. What does that mean, when he was weaned, exactly?
They quit nursing.
When they quit nursing him. That's a little amorphous, isn't it? We don't know exactly how old Samuel was, but it's thought he was somewhere between 3 and 5 years old. Probably 3 to 4 years old. Now, when you think about a 3-year-old child, what kind of memories do you have from when you were 3?
Zilch.
Especially being gone from your parents. I was thinking about this last night, and in my own very strange and bizarre life, which I've shared some of it with you over the years. When I was 3 years old and about 5 months, my parents, who lived in California, sent me to Oklahoma. They sent me to Oklahoma with Vernon and Mary Black. And yes, we got our kicks on Route 66. That's the way that we went to Oklahoma, all the way to Miami, Oklahoma. So I was 3 years and 5 months, roughly. And I was gone from home for a month.
Wow.
Yeah, for an entire month. This Christmas of 1959 with my mom and dad, but had it with my grandparents in Oklahoma. I don't really remember feeling lonely. I don't remember missing my parents. I remember it as sort of an adventure. So, it's interesting when you try to think about what was in Samuel's mind as such a young child. Sometimes we don't have a lot to relate it with because most people's parents were not as unusual as my own. But from a very young age, I was quite often on my own. That was not an unusual thing for me to be gone from home for up to 4 or 5 weeks at a time. From the time I was 3 and a half until I was a sophomore in high school. So he's the point though is he's very young, and we have sort of this visceral reaction, right, to thinking about a mother taking her, let's say he was 4 years old, taking a 4-year-old and dropping him off with Eli. On the other hand, Eli was a very, very godly man. But he's dedicated to God from really before his birth. What else do we know about Samuel? What else comes to mind when we think of him?
Faithful.
He's not only faithful, he's faithful to an incredible degree, isn't he? Because basically, near the end of his life, he's going to give one of those speeches like Paul gives, where it's like, I coveted nobody's gold or silver or apparel. I didn't want anything anybody else had. So how many of us can say that we've never been even a little bit envious of what somebody else had? And yet, Samuel seems to be able to say that in good conscience, right? So that's certainly an incredible quality or characteristic that Samuel possesses. Not unique to Samuel, but it's pretty rare in human beings. Because most of the time, we're all about keeping up with the Joneses. Right? And a lot of times we don't even care about X until we see that, when I see that Rick's got it, then all of a sudden I kind of would like to have that too. Not because I need it, not because it's useful to me, but because there's this part of us where as human beings we tend to be jealous of people who we think have more than we have, or who we think are doing better than we have. And the characteristic Samuel has is he doesn't care. Somebody's got a lot, I'm genuinely happy. I, from time to time, have relatives who brag to me about how much money they're making. And I say, terrific! You will not be borrowing money from me then. This is a good thing. It's good you're doing well. I'm happy for you. I hope you do even better. Make as much money as you can and don't bother me. Because people that I've known that have real wealth, guess what happens with their relatives? They come out of the woodwork with their hands out. And this is why sometimes professional athletes who make tens of millions of dollars can end up broke. You can give away $100 million. It can be done. Takes some effort. If you need any help, call me. I'll show you how to do it. It's not a simple thing, but it can be done when hundreds of people effectively have their hands out. So he's a very godly man. He's not the person who's jealous of others. He's a person who's all about serving God. What else do we know about Samuel?
Human, toward the end, when Israel wanted a king, he felt rejected, I think.
All right, so Israel wants a king. Why don't they have a king? Every other country's got a king. Why is Israel so behind?
Because God was their king.
Well, God was their king, but how does God rule over Israel in the absence of a king? He would appoint judges. When there was an appropriate time of need, judges were appointed. So you have a country that is a theocracy, so there's a union of church and state, right? In the United States, we try to separate church and state to sort of an absurd point. In the Constitution, it says Congress is not supposed to make any law about an established church, right? In Great Britain, there was an established church. The church in Great Britain was the Anglican Church. The head of the Anglican Church, the first head of the Anglican Church, was Henry VIII. And if you didn't agree that the Anglican Church was the one true church in England, he literally had you beheaded, including one of his best friends. It didn't matter who you were. If you weren't going to swear allegiance to the king was going to have you beheaded. They had an established church. There was a union in England, effectively, of church and state in the person of the king, right? Israel is a union of church and state, but instead of it being united in the person of a king, God is ruling over the children of Israel, and he's ruling over the children of Israel through judges, and the last judge is going to be Samuel. And Samuel does feel like he's being rejected, because what kind of a judge has he been? He's been great. He's been like the best judge they've ever had. Are they grateful to Samuel? No. Not in the least. People aren't grateful, right? Jesus tries to express this to us over and over again. When he heals the 10 lepers and only one comes back to thank him, and that one is the Samaritan, and Jesus says, well, where are the 9? How grateful were people in Jesus' day for what Jesus did for them? By and large, most of them weren't very grateful. So as human beings, we've got this kind of blind spot when it comes to gratitude. Sometimes there's an expression made that so-and-so, was born on third base and thought he hit a triple, kind of a thing, like came from money, and his parents had money, and his family had money, and they had generational wealth, and yet, somehow he's taking credit for everything that he did. Some people are born on third base who become incredibly famous. Sometimes they have great abilities on their own. A lot of times they don't. In our own country, J.P. Morgan's father, Junius Morgan, was one of the wealthiest men in the world when he died. Now, J.P. Morgan was nobody's fool, and he took that money, to the next level. But believe me, he was born on third base, right? Might have been born right next to home. Come to think of it, he just had to put his foot out, and boom, he was right there. We tend not to be very grateful. We tend not to be very appreciative as human beings. The children of Israel are not grateful for the greatness of Samuel. What are they looking at when they decide they want a king? What is it that they at least use as their excuse or the prompt?
Like everybody else.
Well, part of it is they want to be like everybody else, which is a very human tendency. We see that in religion all the time. Sometimes, we think, well, we've got to be like the Baptists or the Methodists. We need to keep up with the Christian church. We don't have enough people coming in. We've got this, we've got that. And instead of looking to God, we look towards other churches that are every bit as messed up as sometimes we are, right? Because we're looking at the wrong things. We're thinking about things in the wrong light. And certainly one of the things they're going to tell them is, well, everybody else has got a king, so therefore we ought to have a king. That's no argument for anything. But it's an argument we make all the time. We've got to be like everybody else. Why? I grew up, as I said, in a little bit of an odd family. Believe me, the last thought that ever crossed my mother's mind was that I needed to be like everybody else. Never even entered her mind in a small way. We were going to be different. My father used to say, son, remember, eagles soar alone, dogs run in packs. Don't be like everybody else. That's unusual. And sometimes when you're a kid, it's uncomfortable, because what do kids want?
Fit in.
We want to be like everybody else. We want to fit in. We want to be part of we want to be part of the cool crowd, don't we? And yet what happens to most of us as we grow up? How many people are going to get in the cool crowd? It's a very small number, or it wouldn't be the cool crowd. My best friend, from the time I was 3 years old till I was 10, was a young man named Robbie Riddle. Robbie and I did everything together. We lived next door to each other. I thought Robbie was the brother that I never had, right? Well, on Robbie's 10th birthday party, he was having a slumber party, and I got the invitation, and Robbie had been talking about this slumber party, and I was quite excited. And then Robbie told me, I didn't want to invite you to the party at all. My mom made me, but you don't get to sleep over. You just get to come to the regular party. My friend had become one of the cool kids. And what happened to me? And of course, when I went and told this tale of woe to my mom was like, you're going to the party. You're going to have a good time at the party, and it doesn't matter that you're not spending the night. And by the way, we're going to invite so-and-so over whose parents are divorced, and somebody who needs a friend, and you're going to take care of that kid tonight. This is my mom, right? We want to be part of the cool kids, but most of us have a moment like that. Maybe not as extreme, but most of us have a moment like that when a child we were very close to all of a sudden throws us over because we're not cool. And they want to be part of the cool kids. We've got this in us innately, right? And so God is constantly trying to tell us, who should we be trying to please? God. My life ought to be about trying to please God. It doesn't matter whether Robbie Riddle invited me to his 10th birthday party. Robbie, by the way, has passed away. He had a tough, he ended up having a very, very tough life. So strange things sometimes happen to us, and things that we don't always relate to and understand. They wanted to be like the other nations around them. This is one of the two excuses they're going to give. Everybody else has got a king. We ought to have a king. God's like, that's no argument. Doesn't matter what everybody else is doing. My life needs to be about serving God and about doing what's right. And if I can't point to a thus saith the Lord, if I can't point to a principle in Scripture that backs up what I'm doing, it does not matter what everybody else does. And it's interesting that people that are people of conviction can sometimes do things that seem strange to our mind, the way that we think. And yet because they are so convicted in what they do, you still respect them. In other words, they're following this rule, I'm going to please God no matter what. And when they're trying to please God, sometimes we think, well, they're being extreme, or they're doing something that's odd or unusual. But if it's about pleasing God, it's a good thing. And maybe they are making a mistake, but they're coming at it from the right way. This is the way we ought to come at things as Christians. We should come at things as Christians with the idea that we want to get as close as to be as close as to what God wants me to be as possible, and then stop. We've got a lot of trouble with stopping. So they wanted to be like everybody else. Churches have been split more times over Christians wanting to be like everybody else than almost any single thing I can think of. And Samuel is like, he's not about that. His mind doesn't function in that way. What's the second reason they give him for wanting a king?
I think they say they want somebody to fight their battles.
Well, they want somebody to fight their battles, which is kind of like being like everybody else, right? The king is supposed to go out there and lead the troops bravely into battle. Quite often kings got killed doing that, by the way. Fairly high mortality rate. What about Samuel's sons? He has 2 sons, and what do we know about them? They're trouble. They're not walking in his footsteps. They're taking bribes. They're acting in ways that are inappropriate. And the children of Israel think, well, the solution to this problem is give us a king. What is wrong with that picture? The king is human, but more to the point.
They're taking God out of the equation.
Well, they certainly were taking God out of the equation, but just think about the logic of, we don't want Samuel because he's got these 2 deadbeat sons, so instead give us a king.
Whose sons are going to become king?
They're going to be deadbeats. I can predict with almost total certainty that the son of any king or queen is almost always going to be a deadbeat. Are there exceptions? Yes, they're few and far between. The kings of Israel, right, rule Israel for 250 years, whatever it is, And after the kingdom is divided between Jeroboam and Rehoboam, how many good kings do they have? Give you a hint. 0. Not a single good king in 200 years. Right? But what happens when you have a king who's got a son? As opposed to a judge.
He's supposed to be the next king.
What happens when you have a king that has children?
They become kings or royalty.
Their royalty, or in the Bible, it's described how?
Heirs.
Heirs? What does David say about Saul?
The anointed.
He's God's anointed. He's God's anointed. If I'm the son of a king and I'm God's anointed, what does that mean? You can't kill me. This is better than a get out of jail free card, right? And what do we know happens twice with David? Twice with David, he could have killed Saul, and what does he say?
He's God's anointed.
He's God's anointed. He's a deadbeat. He's not following God at all. He's become a sad figure of who Saul once was. The great promise that Saul had when he originally became king is all gone. He's doing his best to kill David. And David's like, well, he's God's anointed. He's got to get out of jail card free. At one point, he cuts off part of his shirt, right? And what does the text say was David's reaction to having done that to Saul? Doesn't harm him at all. Cuts off a little piece of his clothing.
But it was disrespectful.
He felt bad. Disrespectful. This is the man trying to kill you. This is the man trying to kill you. He's completely within David's power. David's like, he's God's anointed. Believe me, kings love this stuff. Of course I'm God's anointed. Therefore, if I'm God's anointed, what can I do? I can do whatever I want. I'm the king. It's good to be the king. I can do whatever I want. And this idea of kingship held sway in the world for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And of course, it's the obnoxious English that bring this idea to a close. Or they make it the beginning of the end, shall we say. Because Oliver Cromwell realizes that so much about what Samuel said is completely correct. This is what Samuel tells the people a king will do to them. He says, we should like to see all the pipes of, 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 10, if you've got your Bible. 1 Samuel 8, starting with verse 10. He said, this will be the manner that the king shall reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself and for his chariots to be his horsemen. Some shall run before his chariots. He will appoint him captains over thousands and captains over 50s. He will set them his ear to the ground to reap his harvest, to make his instruments of war, his instruments of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be confectionaries and to be cooks and to be bakers. He will take your fields and your vineyards and your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. And he will take the tenth of your seed and of your vineyards and give to his officers and to his servants. He will take your men servants and your maidservants and your goodliest young men. He'll take your donkeys and put them to his work. He'll take a tenth of your sheep, and you shall be his servants, and you'll cry out in that day because of your king which you shall have chosen. The Lord will not hear you. Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, nope, we want a king. It's like, this guy is going to make your life miserable. Here's what he's going to do, step by step by step by step. This is what kings have always done, right? It's what kings have always done. Yes?
They want a king so badly because they thought he would take care of them better.
Well, he gives the reasons, right? Everybody else has got one, so that this must be the right way to go. He's going to fight our battles for us. He's going to, certainly they're thinking the king is going to make life better than it had been under the judges. But the judges were divinely appointed by God himself. So when Samuel is all upset about their rejecting me because they want a king, God says they've not rejected you, they've rejected me. So this whole business about monarchs and people being divinely appointed and being God's anointed and all this kind of stuff, every king ate that up. And then along comes Oliver Cromwell in the 1600s in England, and he builds something called the Model Army, and instead of appointing people simply because they were friends of the king, which is what the King of England had to do, Charles I, His generals in the English Civil War are all these lords and dukes, and they're idiots. They've been idiots for hundreds of years. They can't possibly compete against a well-run army. And Cromwell defeats the king in a fairly short amount of time. Not only does he defeat the King of England, by the way, he conquers Scotland, something that no English king had ever been able to do. And he conquers and subjugates Ireland, something that no English king had ever been able to do. Why? Because he selects people based on merit, not whether they're the duke or the duchess or whatever they might be. Kings take people like that and they raise up their friends and their buddies and their cronies and their compatriots. They don't rule the way that people ought to be ruled, and then they want to claim we're ruling by divine right. Charles I believed until the minute his head was cut off by Cromwell that I am ruling by divine right, right? And what else do kings do? When he's listing the material side of things, what's he really saying that a king's going to do?
He takes all the money.
You're going to take all the money. Go to Great Britain. Go to Great Britain. Go to any one of the royal palaces. Any one of them. The amount of treasure in those places is completely insane. Is it enough? No, never enough. Got to have more, more, more. The amount of money that flows into the English monarchy, which, by the way, wasn't even taxed until fairly recently, is obscene. And yet you have poor people all over England. And what does the king really care at the end of the day? They don't care. And so one of the things that goes on, one of the lessons that we learn from Samuel is don't be like the nations around you. That's not an argument. Everybody else is doing it. I learned as a child very quickly was no excuse for anything because my father expected me to be better than everybody else. The standard is not what others are doing. But that's the path that so often we get sucked into. We think this is okay because everybody else is doing it. And sometimes we lose things that are of just incredible value because we can't see the big picture. We can't see the things that God is really calling on us to see. The British Empire was built over 600 years, one king after another. And this idea that the king was ruling because of God's power does not really begin to erode until the 1600s. So the beginning of the destruction of that idea doesn't really start until Oliver Cromwell. And then you start to have other problems, other situations where the king is killed, including during the French Revolution, which gets completely out of hand. And Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette are both beheaded on the guillotine. People start to realize maybe the kings aren't that bright. And of course, in more modern times, the First World War is caused when the Kaiser, the king of Germany, who, by the way, was Queen Victoria's grandson. They're all related to each other. They were all inbred. They all had all sorts of problems because of the fact that they're marrying cousins, first cousins quite often. But the Kaiser ends up attacking all these other kingdoms. And of course, you end up with that's the end of the Tsar in Russia. Also, by the way, the Tsar, Nicholas I, was the first cousin of King George V. If you look at photographs of George V and the Tsar Nicholas and you put them side by side, they almost look like twins. So they were all related to each other. They were all inbred with each other, and they all caused incredible destruction. And the destruction of the First World War, and some people will argue that the First World War and Second World War are one war with a long armistice in between. However you want to set it up. It was all led by the greed of people who thought that they were doing the will of God because they all thought that they were God's anointed. So it was a very common, a very prevalent, a very powerful idea. We think we've got to have what everybody else has. And Samuel tries to warn the people and says, if you do that, if you act like that, you're just going to get yourself into trouble. And why would the goal be to be like everybody else anyway?
Fit in.
Why?
To fit in.
To fit in, what does fitting in that context ultimately mean?
Not stand out as different.
I don't want to stand out as different, right? I'm looking at my own situation and saying, well, this isn't very good. This isn't very efficient. I mean, a monarchy is very efficient. And if I'm best friends with the king, that's a good thing. So I wanted a more efficient system of government, I thought, than what God was providing to me, with God being my king. So you've got God as your king, you've got Saul as your king. What situation really was better? Obviously, God being the king was. But the children of Israel couldn't see it, because this is what those kind of concepts do. They blind us. It's easy to be blinded, isn't it? Sometimes it's so hard to see the truth, and yet the truth is usually so simple. And sometimes a little, there's that expression in, Psalms, the 8th chapter, a little child shall lead them. Sometimes a little kid says the obvious thing. You remember the story of the king who'd been told he had this wonderful set of clothing when he wasn't wearing anything at all, and the little kid goes, why isn't he wearing any clothes? And then all of a sudden, everybody realizes the same thing all at the same time. So we get ourselves into difficulty when we apply the wrong standard. And quite often it tears up the people of God, because some people think, well, we need to be like this denomination, or these people are doing this. Look at what God says. If we stick to what God says, we're going to be all right. If we start looking around at what everybody else is doing, we're going to get ourselves in a lot of trouble. So Samuel comes. He comes as a very small child, probably 3.5 or 4 years old. He comes to Eli. Eli takes good care of him. And we find Samuel growing in favor, it says, with both the Lord and also with men, 1 Samuel 2:26. Eli's got 2 very evil sons, by the way. It's interesting in the Old Testament, you might ask yourself, who's got good sons? Because it's a fairly short list, right? Israel has 12 sons. And what do we know about the first 10? There's hardly a decent one in there. Right? And then Joseph comes along. See, if Joseph had been the firstborn, I don't know whether you've ever been around a couple where their first kid is just unusually compliant and adorable and sweet, like I'm sure that I was as a child. And then the second child comes along and they're just as mean as the devil. And when they have the first child, what do you think they're seeing when they're at the restaurants and your kid is like beating up his brother or sister? They're thinking, you're a bad parent. They're thinking, you have no idea what you're doing. You should come and learn from me. I'm the expert. I have this wonderful, adorable child. Then they have child number 2, and what happens? It's funny what different personalities children have, right? The second child is hell on wheels. They're a holy terror. They're destructive, uncontrollable. And it turns out that the first set of people who thought they were such good parents, they really weren't good parents at all. They just had a sweet, compliant, adorable child. And so here you have Israel, the first 10 children, starting with Reuben and Levi and Simeon and Judah, and they're a tough bunch. They're not very godly. And God ends up working on them. They end up ultimately being better people. But Joseph stands alone, doesn't he? He's one of the most remarkable men that ever lived. And I don't think it's got a thing to do with who his parents were. Right? But as parents, what do we like to do? We want to take credit for the good kids and blame somebody else for the bad kids. And, this is the way that we tend to think. Now, I don't mean by that, you can't make a difference in terms of how you raise your child. But the reality is Eli has 2 evil sons. Samuel has 2 evil sons. And Saul, who ends up being a wicked king, has what kind of sons? He's got Jonathan, right? Coming out of the dysfunction that is King Saul comes Jonathan. So one of the things we know is no matter how good you are, no matter how righteous you are, no matter how godly you are, you got a pretty good chance that some or all of your children aren't going to follow that example. That's just the reality. Which means if you have a monarchy, if you have a kingdom where you're telling people that these people are God's anointed and you have to do whatever they say no matter what it is, you're going to have problems. And you're going to have much bigger problems than you do under the judges, where you can say Eli will no longer be a judge, his sons won't be judges, it's going to be Samuel. Kings are hard to get rid of, even when they should be getting rid of. In our own time, England still has what they call this constitutional monarchy. Think about Queen Elizabeth's kids. Enough said. Trouble from the word go, and yet you've got all these strange customs. You know, you go to be knighted and a grown man kneels in front of this little old lady and she taps the sword. It's preposterous. But what do we think in our mindset? Oh, how cool that is. She met the queen. He met the queen. He got knighted. It's all craziness. But it's all left over from this idea that being a king or queen meant something, this idea that prevailed for this incredible amount of time. So Samuel comes into the house of Eli. Eli's got two sons that are fairly wicked. But Samuel, the child Samuel, ministered unto the Lord before Eli, and the word of the Lord was precious in those days. There was no open vision, 1 Samuel 3:1. Sometimes people quote from the Old Testament, the people perish for lack of vision. And people start talking about, we've got to have a vision for what the church should be. We've got to look ahead. People will perish without a vision. No, vision is prophecy. People were perishing for lack of vision didn't mean that they didn't have foresight. It meant they weren't having the word of the Lord delivered to them. That's what's going on here. The word of the Lord was precious in those days. There was no open vision. God wasn't talking to them because of the evil that was going on. The Lord came and stood and called as at other times, Samuel, Samuel. Samuel answered, speak, for thy servant heareth. So here he is as a small child, and God is communicating with Samuel. And of course, the message that he gives Samuel is not a good message. You see, the reality is for us as human beings, we all need a lot of work, don't we? So when somebody starts telling us how great we are and how swell we are, we should try to figure out what is it that they're really wanting. Because the reality is we all need work. We're on a journey, aren't we? We're trying to be transformed into the image of Christ. Right? I'm not there. I'm a work in progress. Which means when I'm talking to the man of God, what kind of message is the man of God going to be delivering to me? Most days, anyway. You need to be better. You need to repent. You need to be more godly. You need to be more faithful. You need to study the Word of God more. You need to pray more. You need to be more like Jesus. Right? So the Word of God comes to Samuel, and what's the message that Samuel gets to deliver? It's not good news. He's going to tell Eli that Eli's sons are going to die on the same day and that Eli is going to die as well. And Eli knows that God has spoken to Samuel and he wants Samuel to tell him what God said. Right? So if God is delivering a message to me that something really bad is going to happen to John and I love John Wright, do I want to tell John? No, I don't. I don't want to ruin his day. I'd rather you ruin it, Rick. I'll share it with you, then you can tell John, right? No, I don't want to tell him. Samuel didn't want to tell Eli, but Eli insists. Because Eli, for his two obnoxious sons, which apparently he doesn't try to control, Samuel apparently tries to control his sons. But Samuel loves Eli, and the news is going to be, Eli, your sons are both going to die on the same day, and bad things are going to happen to your family. But Eli wants to know, and when the message is delivered, Eli accepts the message because Eli loves and respects God. One of the things that happens after Samuel dies is God allows Samuel's spirit to come back, right? You remember when Saul everything has gone wrong for Saul. So Saul is, in my mind, one of the most pathetic human beings you read about in the Scripture, because he's got enough good in him to know that he's doing evil. And he never seems to quite completely crush the good. The Bible talks about how we can destroy our conscience. If I do what I know is evil and I do it long enough, I'm going to crush my conscience, and so I won't feel bad about it anymore. It won't trouble me in the least, right? We crush the conscience. Well, Saul is this conflated person who's doing evil, and yet he kind of knows what's right. And some days he is humbled and he can see the truth, but he can't act. Saul has passed the point of no return in that he's never going to do the right thing, even though he knows what it is. But it bothers him. So anyway, he goes, he sees a woman that we know as the witch of Endor, and he wants to talk to Samuel. And so she says she'll bring Samuel up. Now, do I think the witch of Endor brought Samuel up? Absolutely not. She's as stunned as Saul is when he appears. But what kind of message does Samuel deliver from the dead to Saul? You're going to die. You're going to die. You want to talk to somebody from the dead? It's not a good idea, even if you can. Because if they tell you anything other than bad news, you're not really talking to somebody from the dead. When we want to talk to people from the dead, we want them to, oh, life is so good. And, it's sort of a part of our culture, isn't it? You'll have some football player whose father passed away, whatever, and he'll score the big touchdown, and what will they say? My father was looking on from heaven. If your father was really looking on from heaven, all the stuff you did, he'd be in a crazy place in heaven. That's what would happen. The dead, Solomon says in Ecclesiastes, the dead know not anything under the sun. Once you're dead, you're not going to know what's going on here. And that's not a bad thing. That's not a bad thing. So, people that are prophets of God are going to be delivering the message. The message quite often is a message that's going to be challenging. I should, as a Christian, want to be challenged. I should want to be more like God and more like Christ. I should want to be a better man. Eli accepts the message of God. Samuel ends up being killed or Saul rather ends up being killed in battle. So, in any event, one of the things we need to keep in mind as Christians, one of the lessons we learn from Samuel is sometimes the truth is terrifying. And when I'm hearing preaching and I'm reading the Bible and I'm thinking about the things of God, if I'm only filled with warm and fuzzy feelings, I'm probably not doing it right. I probably need to be paying a little bit more attention because God wants me to be a better man today than I was yesterday. And that means recognizing what my weaknesses are, recognizing what my failures are, recognizing that I'm not a perfect person, recognizing when I say and do the wrong thing. Most of us know. Right? What tends to happen to us when we do the exact wrong thing? How does our mind tend to work?
Many times we try to rationalize it.
We try to rationalize it, right? And when rationalizing it would mean what?
Just finding some way to make it okay.
Finding some way to make it okay. They didn't really take that horrible thing the way that I said it. Right? I can remember very vividly one of the first, maybe second elders meeting I was ever at. Jim Brantley was at this meeting. He probably doesn't remember this because he's a very kind-hearted guy, but we're having this long conversation about whatever. And one of the elders was pontificating on a particular subject. Now, I was a very young man to be an elder at that time. And I said, well, maybe later you'll be able to write your own book and you can call it the second greatest story ever told. All the elders laughed. But do you think that I don't know that I said the wrong thing in that moment? But what do you think I did about it? What do we tend to do? Right? We tend to do nothing. And after all, everybody that was there laughed. But maybe Jim didn't laugh. I should be careful, I guess, about that. But yeah, everybody laughed, so they thought it was funny, and the person that I made the comment to, they laughed, so surely they must have taken it okay. And that's what I talked myself into. But that's completely absurd, isn't it? Because what do we know about human beings? They don't have thick skins. They don't have thick skins. And it was an unkind, unchristian, cutting thing to say. And the next day, Greg York called me up and said, Brother so-and-so is very upset about what you said. And I said, of course he is. Because it was the wrong thing to do. So I went and I apologized. We rationalize what we do. And what would happen in that case if several weeks had gone by and nobody had ever brought it up? Would have been lost in the ether of time. Because I would have rationalized it and thought that at the end of the day it didn't really matter. It wasn't a big deal. It was true. I don't know what all I would have thought. But those kinds of things would go through and enter our mind. We need to call each other to be better. And Samuel, you find him all about that. He calls the children of Israel to be better. He calls himself to be better. He calls himself to be God's man. And we're going to see that in Samuel's life, he was very, very successful at doing that. Sometimes the truth is terrifying because it means I've got to change. Something was to happen that God said would make everybody's ears tingle in Israel, and that was the judgment that was going to come to Eli and his sons. God said, the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be purged with sacrifice nor offering forever. 1 Samuel 3:14. Let me read that again. The iniquity of Eli's house shall not be purged with sacrifice nor offering forever. What's being said about Eli and his house? They've reached the point of no return. Now, that doesn't often kind of fit our view of how God works, right? We want to say you can always come back. Well, there's a sense in which that's true. But there's a sense in which human beings do reach the point of no return, isn't there? Because what happens to them?
They give up.
They get what?
They give up.
They give up? What else do they do?
Hardened and bitter.
They become hardened and bitter, right? They do kill their conscience. And if I've killed my conscience, now what happens?
Whatever I want to do, I'll do.
Whatever I want to do, I'll do, and you can't convince me that anything that I'm doing is wrong, right? What God is looking for in his people are people with a good and honest and a tender heart. He wants people to be pricked and cut. He wants people that when they say the wrong thing, realize it immediately, or even better, they take those thoughts captive, right? I mean, what would have happened in the example I gave if instead of saying what I said, I just thought it? Now, would it have been a good thing to think it? No. And if I'm building a good and honest and a tender heart, I would be horrified that I even thought it. But what's the difference between thinking something and saying something?
Big deal.
You can't unring the bell, right? You can't unring the bell. And look, godly Christian people, they do their best to forgive you, don't they? If we're being who God wants us to be, we're doing the best we can to try to forgive and to forget as much as we can. But sometimes it's outside our capacity as human beings to forget. Right? If I went in for surgery and the doctor cut off the wrong leg, I could forgive him, but when I look down where my leg should be, it's not like I don't know what happened. I've forgotten. No! There are certain harms that, as a matter of course, as much as we want to be able to forget them, we can't because we're not God. I'm called to do my best to put those things aside and to treat those things in such a way that they don't impact who I am. But the difference between the action and just thinking about it is dramatic. And that affected my relationship with that particular person it was probably 2 or 3 years before he could really forgive me. And I realized I caused that, you see. So when I talked to him and asked him to forgive me, he said, I'll have to think about it. That was his response. Now you could say, well, shame on him. Who caused the problem? Me. So you give people time, right? You give people time and you realize and try to learn some humility, and you try to understand if I'm going to be God's servant, then sometimes I'm going to have to go the extra mile, and if this person has a good and an honest heart, he'll get past that, and he did. He did. But the difference between thinking something and saying something is dramatic. As Christians, we're to take every thought captive. We need to be very, very careful. So sometimes those of us that are known as a little on the too glib side can get ourselves into trouble. And it doesn't mean that I don't have a wonderful, sense of humor, make people laugh, but it's not my job to be Jerry Seinfeld, right? It's my job to encourage people, comfort people. It's my job to be Christ-like. And if we lose that lesson, we say and do things that are harmful. So keep this in mind. I don't want to just bottle stuff up inside me either, right? If I'm really feeling somebody needs to be talked to, there's a Christian way to do that, right? There's an appropriate way to do that. Or sometimes I'll realize that what I thought was a problem is really just my own problem. But nobody wants to be embarrassed in front of everybody else, particularly by an impertinent whippersnapper. John says this in 1 John chapter 5:16, if you see any brother or sister commit a sin that does not lead to death, you should pray, and God will give them life. I refer to those whose sin does not lead to death, but he says there is a sin that leads to death, and I'm not saying that you should pray about that. Again, 1 John 5:16. He's saying there's a point of no return. There's certain situations where people can't be helped. They've simply gone too far. Now, as long as there's life, we like to say there's hope, right? But some people's conscience is so seared by a hot fire that there's not going to be much that's going to be doable. And this is a recognition of that fact. Eli and his sons were too far gone. They weren't coming back because they'd been involved in so much evil. And God's like, I've had enough. Samuel, it says, judged Israel all the days of his life. 1 Samuel 7:15. We know that Samuel was respected for his leadership. So for his entire life, he is respected as the judge over Israel. Now, ultimately, Samuel is going to anoint not one but two kings. I've always wondered when David is like, I can't kill the Lord's anointed, but you're also the Lord's anointed, and he's got no trouble trying to kill you. There seems to me to be something wrong with David's logic. But I think in David's mind, he wasn't going to take personal revenge. To me, that's more of the issue than whether God had anointed him or not. But it played well with his men, right? So Samuel is going to anoint not one, but two kings over Israel. So it's 10:17. We'll put a peg in it and come back to lessons from the life of Samuel next Sunday. But I would encourage you, read 1 Samuel. It's a great book. Samuel is one of the greatest men that ever lived. He's one of the most inspiring men that ever lived. He's one of the most honest men that ever lived. We can learn a lot from the life of Samuel. Thank you for your time and your comments. And again, we'll finish this up next Sunday.